All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's event. I'm Jason Gumpert from msdynamicsworld.com. This is our October 2022 Portals community call. As always, we are here with Nicholas Hayduke. Great to have him back as always for today's event. And the main topic is going to be JavaScript with Power Pages. So without too much further delay, just a couple of notes. We are recording today's event. We'll be sharing that with all of you. And we also welcome your questions. So please look for the questions block in the webcast interface. Ask them at any time. I know Nick always keeps an eye on that as he goes. And with that, I think we are ready to begin. Nick, the floor is yours.
Awesome. All right. Thank you. So yeah, thanks to Jason, and yeah, thanks for everyone for attending. It's been a big month for Power Pages, Power Apps Portals, whatever you want to call it, and so we certainly have lots of news to cover. And yeah, we'll talk about JavaScript as well with Power Pages. So exciting times in this space for sure. So, quick intro, if this is your first time joining the call with us, my name is Nicholas Hayduke, the president and a software engineer with Engineered Code Consulting, Inc., based in Regina, Saskatchewan, Canada. I'm a Microsoft MVP, and essentially my entire career has been focused on Power Apps Portals or Power Pages or whatever it happens to be called this week. I worked at a company called ADX Studio, which is the company that built the original version of this software, and Microsoft acquired them in 2015. So if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, follow me on Twitter. I do have a blog that has lots of good old information. Still, a lot of it's accurate. Haven't done blog posts in a while, but we do have our YouTube channel where we do put up a weekly, kind of short 2-minute type video tip, as well as the Refresh the Cast podcast that I'm now doing with George Dubinsky, another MVP that does quite a bit of Portals work. So we've got new episodes of that. We've recorded a couple, and we're looking to have a pretty good regular cadence on that. So hopefully, a couple a month kind of thing. So feel free to follow me on any of those social channels. Moving on. Just as always, want to express my gratitude towards Jason and the entire team over at MS Dynamics World, who have supported this Portals community call endeavor over the last almost 3 years now, I think. I don't know if we're ever going to come up with a new name for it. Pages Community Call doesn't sound very good to me, but if anyone has a name that will reflect the new naming at Microsoft, we could potentially do that. But yeah, just want to thank Jason and his team for all the support for doing these calls every month. Yeah, so the agenda, we will, like I said, get through the news today. Just a ton of news, probably the busiest month of news ever. And then we'll get into today's topic. We'll talk about when the next call is, and then hopefully have some time for Q&A if people do have any specific questions that they want to ask related to any of the stuff. But as Jason mentioned, just as we're going through here, if you have questions about anything that I'm kind of rambling on about here, please drop that into the questions area, and I'll do my best to keep an eye on it. And Jason, feel free to jump in if I'm ignoring those questions, because I'm so enveloped in what I'm doing. So, all right, news. I guess the big news is that Power Pages is now generally available. So what was before a preview product or preview version or preview feature, whatever you want to call it, last time we spoke, it was Power Pages was still in preview. Microsoft did announce at Ignite, so that was a couple of weeks ago, that Power Pages is GA. So that means Power Apps Portals essentially doesn't exist anymore because they are the same product. Essentially, Power Pages is just the latest version of what was previously known as Power Apps Portals. So since the latest version is now generally available, that means if you have a Power Apps Portal, it is a Power Page site. And we'll actually talk about that in some of our other news here on the next slide about what, if you have old stuff, how do you get access to the new stuff? So the Power Pages going GA, that was, exciting news. But it's something we knew was coming. I mean, it's obviously if someone releases something in preview, more often than not always, but like we knew that Power Pages was going to become generally available. But what was more of a surprise to some was the fact that licensing has changed. And so I don't know if there was a person that I knew that loved the licensing model that Power Apps Portals had. And so I honestly really think that this new licensing model that they've come up with is a huge step in the right directions. In fact, I mean, you could be nitpicky with anything, but I think that they really got this right. Now, I'm not going to comment on whether, X number of dollars is the appropriate price for this product. There are all sorts of scales of different businesses, and people pay lots of money for software, or there's some stuff that's open source and it's free. So I'm not going to really comment on whether I think $100 or $1,000 or $1 million is the appropriate price for a particular product. I can tell you that lots of people pay lots of money in the old model. So my concern with the old model was never like, okay, is X number of dollars too much for a portal? For me, it was always how difficult it was to estimate on a new project what the licensing would be, and just the I just didn't think that the way that it was, the model that they had before was, it wasn't a common way that anyone else did it, and it just seemed like it just was not good in my opinion. So what the changes that they made, and it's not huge changes, but I think it's just the tweaks they need to make in order to make it predictable, and in order to make it, along the same lines as how other products like this are licensed. So the big thing is that now I say kind of tokens, whereas before every login that you purchased allowed you to access your Power Pages or your Power Apps portal. It allowed you to access it for 24 hours, and then if you logged in again, it kind of counted as another token. Those tokens are now basically monthly. So essentially the licensing is based on monthly active users. So if you're talking to an organization about licensing for Power Apps portals, or if your organization internally is trying to do this, I think it is much more reasonable for an organization to estimate how many monthly active users are going to have on a site. Trying to guess how many people are going to log in on a daily basis, and whether for someone to complete a support case, they're going to log in 5 times or 2 times. I think that's a tough question to ask. I don't know anyone, like in all my time, I never saw anyone who's like, yeah, I'm pretty comfortable with my estimate. It's like, it's always a guess. And people always estimated high. They always said, well, this is going to be the greatest portal in the world, and someone's going to log in every single day. So we basically say it's 30 times the licensing costs. So if you compare it to this model where they haven't really raised the price, they've just basically made it, if a user logs in 30 times in a month, they've made it 30 times cheaper under this new model. But again, I'm not here to talk about the total dollars. I'm more talking about, can you actually estimate what the cost of a Power Pages site is going to be? And I think it's much more reasonable to ask someone to guess how many monthly active users that they're going to have. The other big change, and this was kind of a sticking point, I would say that most organizations didn't run into this, but the ones that did, they were massive. And that was the ability to use these tokens for internal users. So it used to be before, if you were internal, you had to buy a Power Apps license. If you were external, you could use the login licenses. And so if you created a like an internal help desk type thing, if users want to access that, I mean, the minimum you're looking at is the $5 a month per app plan with Power Apps. And it just wasn't practical to have an entire organization buy Power Apps licenses for everyone, just in case they needed to have the help desk. Now, when they introduced pay-as-you-go, that alleviated some of it, but again, the licensing cost was high. I mean, if you go to pay-as-you-go, it's like basically double the cost. So it's like you can spend $10 every time someone logs into the help desk portal. That might be a bit much. So now, when you have internal users, you can choose which way you want to license them. You can purchase Power Apps licenses for them, or you can say if they don't have Power Apps licenses, they can just consume the tokens like the external users can. So those are the two big things in my opinion. One, they've made it monthly versus daily, and they've made it so that internal users can be licensed in the same way as external users. The other change that they made, I don't know how big of an impact this is going to be. I think it's the change that some people wish it was the old way, and that is the fact that anonymous is now per user as well. They're using cookies and other techniques to try to identify what is considered an anonymous user. So it's one of those things where if you look at the site on one browser and then you open it up in another browser, you kind of count as two users. But essentially, they're going to be trying to track how many anonymous users you have, and then there's tokens for that as well. So before anonymous, we're charged based on page views. Now that model's changed to per user. So that's the one area where perhaps people aren't as thrilled about. To be honest with you, the anonymous use of a portal, we don't see that use case a whole lot. Potentially for some knowledge-based consumption or forums if people are using that. But I'd say the vast majority of the portals that we work on, people are, the first thing you do is you got to log in. If you're not doing that, then, so I think these licensing changes are great. I think they're good. They're a huge step forward. And bluntly, I'm just not embarrassed to talk about licensing anymore. Like if people ask me questions, it's like, yeah, here's a licensing model. It makes sense. Again, if you say, okay, at 100,000 users, it's going to cost me, $50,000 a month. Does it make sense to pay $50,000 a month for a Power Pages environment when you could, build it and host it in Azure? If you built it with custom code for $1,000 a month? Well, I mean, maybe not. Like if you want to go down the custom code route, it's potentially at those really high volumes, the volume licensing may not, may not scale as you wish it would in every situation. A couple things I'd say to that. Well, I mean, if your portal isn't providing the users of the portal with, I think the pricing there is like 25 cents, or it's 50 cents. Like if your portal isn't providing 50 cents of value, I would question whether your portal should be, like if your portal should even exist. Yeah, you have a lot of users, but if you have 100,000 users and they're not getting 50 cents of value, you got to question your portal. And secondly, it never hurts to talk to Microsoft to see if your situation might be a little bit different and if there's some sort of other pricing adjustments they might be able to do if you've got certain volume and you feel like the licensing model doesn't quite fit in your situation. So never hurts to talk to Microsoft as well. So, but yeah, huge changes on the licensing, and I think it's a fantastic thing. And that was the topic of our most recent podcast. So if you want to hear George and I talk about a little bit more, you can go check out that as well. Okay, so as I mentioned, a ton of other news. Basically what happened is Microsoft released it, made Power Pages generally available, and like ever since it's just been new feature after new feature after new feature kind of put on the blog. So this is the way that I keep up to date with all of the news. So if you go to powerpages.microsoft.com, you essentially can get to the community for Power Pages, and in there's a blog, and that's where you're going to see the product team announcing all their latest things. So what you're about to see over these next couple slides is simply a list of the blog posts that have come out over the last, essentially, these are all in the last couple of weeks. So the first one here is that you can use the new studio for older portals. So if you have a Power Apps portals, it's now possible to get into and basically edit those older portals using the new studio. So as I've been saying for a few months here, Power Pages is just the newest version of Power Pages, and you'll be able to use all those tools, and so that's now possible. There is the web application firewall, so the ability to configure a web application firewall that sits in front of your portal. They've announced some features there. There is now Power Pages admin capabilities within the Power Platform Admin Center. So some of the features that are where you're required to go into what was called the Portals Admin Center before, where you could reset the portal, restart your portal, where you can configure custom DNS, those types of things. Those features, I think the long-term plan is to remove the old Portals Admin Center and to move that all into the Power Platform Admin Center. So there are capabilities right now, you can go into the Power Platform Admin Center and see Power Pages things. They've made generally available data set based code components. So code components are PCF controls, and data sets are basically lists or views in the kind of model driven app worlds. So whether that's a list on your Power Pages site or whether that's a subgrid on your Power Pages site, those both now can be replaced with a PCF control. Multi-step forms, which is the new name for what used to be called advanced or web forms, and basic forms have seen significant upgrades in the studio. So you can now create both multi-step and basic forms in the Power Pages studio, and there's quite a few options in there. You can't do everything in there. I don't know if you'll ever be able to do everything in there. There's still links in there to take you back to the portal management app so that you can get to all of those, all the bells and whistles. But certainly if you're just kind of doing, more simple type things, it's possible you don't have to jump to the model-driven app at all. So both multi-step forms and basic forms have capabilities now in the Power Pages studio. There are new features in the setup workspace. So the workspaces are those kind of main tabs on the left-hand side. So if you go into setup, there are new features that they're releasing. Again, we're seeing features that used to kind of exist in make.powerapps.com or within the Power Portals, the Portals Admin Center. Those capabilities are starting to find their way either into the Power Platform Admin Center or into that setup area in Power Pages. All right, next page. We got 2 pages of stuff. Like I said, there's a lot here. So there's the ability to edit Power Pages code within the Visual Studio Code for Web. So if you're not familiar with Visual Studio Code for Web, basically, as it sounds, is VS Code in a browser. And essentially what that is you can click a link and it'll open up certain bits of code. So think of like the content of a page. If you want to edit that in a more kind of code friendly way, you open up in VS Code and can edit it directly, click save, and then it saves it back to Dataverse. So that's kind of an alternative to using the Power Platform CLI, downloading it using the PA Portal download command, and then uploading it. That's kind of an alternative to that. So that's kind of directly within the studio, where you'll get links to open up code within the VS Code for Web. Microsoft released a couple of white papers. So one on the architecture of Power Pages and another one on the security of Power Pages. This was, honestly, it was great because for years when people would ask us about the architecture, we've heard stories, we've had ways of finding out, okay, how does this thing actually work behind the scenes? But you couldn't find any documentation about okay, so there's a Azure Web App that sits there and it talks back to Dataverse and like all those types of architecture type things. When we present that to customers, they just essentially had to trust that we weren't just making things up. So Microsoft has released a couple of white papers that describe both the architecture and the security side of Power Pages. And so that's going to be great to just kind of, give people a better feeling about what the platform is. Now it's kind of documented how some of those things work, so that it's not just people saying it, it's kind of backed by Microsoft as well. Another feature here is the site visibility control. So this is a way to make a site not visible to the outside world. What you have to do before you can see the site is actually log in with your Active Directory account. So this is not like when you can go to a portal and click the sign in button and sign in with Azure AD and be logged into the portal. This is a layer before that. So even to access, say, the home page as an anonymous user, you can make it so someone has to log in first. So they have to log in, and when they see that, they're still anonymous to the portal, but they'd have to have logged in. So this is perfect for situations before production where you want to have a portal up that you're working on, but you don't want to be visible to the outside world. So you make it so that users have to, internal users have to log in with their credentials before they can see it. So there's also the ability to filter based on IP address. That's been there for a while, but I'm not, these days with everyone working remotely, it's difficult to pinpoint all the IP addresses that you'd need to keep things hidden. So this is a great addition to that area. And finally, there have been some updates to the theming capabilities. So some changes to how color palettes work and how you can interact with custom CSS in the Power Pages Studio as well. So that was a lot. Like I said, that's more news than we've ever had. Some months we have no news. This was a whole year's worth of news as far as I'm concerned. So kudos to the product team that's been building out all this stuff. And hopefully we continue to see all these cool things getting released. I don't know if I would expect it to be at this pace all the time, but maybe we'll see. It's lots of great things coming down the pipe for Power Pages. All right, I don't see any questions about any of the news. So we can move on to today's topic, which is JavaScript with Power Pages. So I've talked a little bit about JavaScript before in other sessions that we've done here. I do have a number of tips, and in fact, right now in our Power Pages tips, we're going through some of these JavaScript things as well as when I was in Orlando a couple weeks ago at the community summit. This was something that came up quite a bit, so I thought it would be a good topic to cover today. Essentially, how do you if you know JavaScript, how do you work? How does that, if you've got those skills, how does that translate to Power Pages? So, like I said, covered some of these things before, but we also had a session that was purely on Liquid, so kind of comparing and contrasting it sometimes with Liquid as well. But JavaScript really went with Liquid the most common technique for customizing Power Pages. This is where you would go from kind of the no-code world into the low-code. Some might consider JavaScript to be more like pro-code, so it's kind of a gray line there. But somewhere between low-code and pro-code is where JavaScript sits. I know lots of people who don't necessarily know JavaScript, but can copy and paste a snippet here or there to add some validation that you can't get out of the box, that sort of thing. So we see lots of people using Liquid and using JavaScript as well with Power Pages. So JavaScript can be added to a bunch of different areas within Power Pages. Anywhere where you can put an HTML, you can generally drop in a script tag and include some JavaScript. But probably more common is a lot of the tables like web pages, basic form, advanced form steps, lists. They have a special attribute called custom JavaScript that you can put your JavaScript in it, and it will do the work to put in a script tag and drop it on the page for you. So lots of different places you can inject JavaScript on your portal. But the big thing to know is that there is no SDK for JavaScript on Power Pages. So if you're coming from the world of model-driven apps, where if you ever touch the DOM with your JavaScript directly, you should get your hand slapped. That is not the case with Power Pages. So there is no specific SDK that's available, so you can essentially manipulate the DOM directly, and that is something that is, it's okay. It's tough to say the word supported. It's basically like custom code, but it's not unsupported in the same way that it would be in a model-driven app. So it is a technique that is well known in the industry to do, and I would be comfortable saying Microsoft doesn't have an issue with people doing that in the same way that they'd have an issue with people manipulating the DOM in a model-driven app. So a couple things to know: Power Pages uses jQuery. So if you're not familiar with jQuery, jQuery is a JavaScript framework. Really had its heyday a few years ago. Back in the day when all the browsers were just so very, very different. They just handled things differently. So the great thing about jQuery is you could write the same code and it generally would work pretty well across the browsers. jQuery is all about, essentially querying the DOM, manipulating the DOM, and it just made our lives, when I got started in this industry in about 2009, it really made our life, we were supporting IE6. Like, who wants to support all the quirks with IE6? So you had jQuery that helped you iron out a bunch of those issues. So Power Pages uses jQuery, and so jQuery references to jQuery exists on every page, so it's just there. You don't have to include your own version. Now you can bring your own framework. So if you want to use something like Angular or React or Vue, you can. I would say the one that we see the most is React, because that seems to be Microsoft's preferred JavaScript framework, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But you can't remove jQuery, so just be aware of, watch out for conflicts. If you're using one of those other things and you're dropping some JavaScript that on the page that might conflict in some way with jQuery, just be careful. In most cases, there's a way to kind of remove the conflicts. So you'll need to do that, because you can't say I don't want jQuery. So when you are writing JavaScript, again, there's no SDK. So there's no specific functions that you have to call into. There's no, there's no classes, or there's none of that you do. So really what we're talking about when it comes to JavaScript development on Power Pages is it's very much more just like traditional web development, not web development that you'd normally see in model-driven apps, Power Platform, that sort of thing. It's just more typical, just pure web development. So, but there are a few kind of tricks to know, and the big one is that if you're using, if you've got a basic or an advanced form, or as they call them, multi-step forms now, if you've got these forms on your page and you're wanting to do things like hide and show fields, because the number one reason people are using JavaScript is that Power Pages doesn't respect business rules. So you may have written all these beautiful business rules for your model-driven app forms, and they just don't apply on the portal. So sometimes you need something more than just required fields, and you need to be able to hide and show fields based on certain criteria, or you need to, this field's required if the value over here is a certain number, whatever it is. You need to implement that using JavaScript. So the thing to know is that when you're looking at a form, whether it's a basic or a multi-step form, the ID of the form fields match the logical names of the columns. So if you have, for example, on the case table, you got the case description. So whatever the column logical name is for that particular field will be the ID of that particular, whether it's a text area or an input or whatever sort of form field you have. So you can rely on that fact. So if you want to hide an area, you typically, what you do is you look at the actual markup that you'll see on the page, and you'll hide not just the field itself, but typically you'll go up the tree a little bit and hide the whole area so that the label is hidden as well. But you can rely on the fact that those fields will have the ID of the columns from Dataverse. The other thing to know is that Portals was built using ASP.NET Web Forms technology. So the actual validation framework that it uses, so when you click to submit something and if a field's required, it relies on the ASP.NET Web Forms validators framework. So that's your text validator, your regular expression validator, that sort of thing. So there is a client-side way to interact with that. So you can essentially create your own custom validators, create your own functions, or create your own required fields, and add those to the to that framework, so that when the user clicks submits, your custom validator is included in the validation alongside all the ones that kind of are created based on the form definition. So if you ever want to kind of play with that, again, we've got some tips going out right now that are related to this, but if you spin up any of the Dynamics 365 portal templates that have the help desk in it, you'll see on the, I think it's the create case or the edit case, has an example of this where you essentially create a validator, you add it to the page_validators array, and that will make it so that when the page loads, or when you click the submit button, it will run through your validation. So it does use the ASP.NET Web Forms validation framework for custom validation. So that's kind of the thing you should know about forms. When we talk about lists, it's important to know that the actual loading of the list happens asynchronously. So it uses Ajax to load every page of the list. So you can't rely on just the page load event if you want to do something like, a common thing would be to change the background of a status column. Well, if you want to do that and you just tie into the, the on ready event or the page loaded event, the problem is when they click to go to the next page, the page doesn't reload, so you won't see your changes there. So on list, there is a loaded event that fires each time a page of data is shown. And again, the documentation has a good example of how to tie into that loaded event. And so basically that will allow you to put it to handle that event so that every time there's a new page of data, it will run your code. So yeah, it's important that not to use the document ready or any sort of page load event when you're dealing with lists. You want to tie into that actual loaded event for each page of data. The other thing to take a look at is, if you're going to be doing a lot of JavaScript work in Power Pages, you have to be comfortable with the developer screens. So typically that's, you hit F12 and you open up all that magical world to be able to inspect the DOM and look at the JavaScript and all that sort of stuff. So you'll notice when you do that, if you look at the markup that exists for a list, which it's a table, you'll see there's a bunch of data dash attributes. So there'll be data dash type, data dash attribute, data dash value, and data dash th. And so those attributes on all of the different parts of the markup will give you extra information that may not be visible to the user, but will help you in your JavaScript coding. So for example, if it's showing a column that has a choice column, and so that's what used to be known as an option set, you can see the underlying numerical value for that thing. So to the user, they just see the text value. But if you want to run your logic based on the actual underlying number, you can do that because that information is in there. So you can see, which column are we referring to? What is the underlying value? Is same with lookups. You can see the ID of fields, that sort of thing. So there's a lot kind of hidden in the again, not hidden away from a regular user, but as a developer, if you go into the developer tools, you can see that there's a lot of clues that you can put in that they're giving you, and you can use those to your advantage when you are writing your JavaScript on Power Pages. All right. As I mentioned, the developer tools are going to be your friend. So most aspects of Power Pages provide consistent IDs or classes that you can use to target elements and make changes. So I mentioned a few of those data attributes there, but just kind of in general, pretty much all the areas that you'll see on Power Pages, they'll give them either a consistent ID or certain classes so that you can target them and manipulate them in the way that you need to on your projects. So none of that is documented. However, it is something that you can discover if you use your developer tools in your browser. All right. So let's talk a little bit about React. So if you're not familiar, React is a JavaScript framework for building out user interfaces. I think it's basically Microsoft's preferred UI framework these days. Its biggest, competitors or other options in that space would be Angular or Vue.js. So, we do see React being used quite a bit in Microsoft's PCF examples. We see React referenced in their Fluent UI web controls. So if you're building out PCF controls that you want to make them so that they feel like they're part of a model-driven app, if you use the Fluent UI, that's what Microsoft is using to build out their web apps these days. So React is certainly seems to be Microsoft's preferred UI framework. And there's no reason that you can't use React on Power Pages. So if you did, if you're a React developer and you want to use React on a Power Page, how can you do that? So, we've historically done that by building essentially a single page application that exists between the header and footer of a page. So you build out a page, that page usually just has that's the single div that, the ID is off. You'll see examples where the ID is root, and that's where your React is configured to load into that particular div. So the actual markup of your page just is a single div. You include the JavaScript for your React code on the page, and it basically just loads up and does that. So I think that's the most common technique that we see, is that you basically just build that single page app that kind of exists between the header and footer. But you can also do it as small little widgets that supplement kind of a custom web template. So you may have a custom web template that has all sorts of different aspects on it, but you just have one little area on there that you want to supplement with a custom React control. So how does one actually do that? So using Webpack, or there's 100 different tools it seems like out there to compile up your React and turn it into a JavaScript file. And then you kind of have to decide, where am I going to host that JavaScript file? You can kind of host it wherever you want. You can upload it to an Azure storage blob, whatever sort of CDN you want to put up there, or you can simply upload it as a web file into Power Pages. And then you just simply include that a reference to that JavaScript file on the page. So when we've done this historically, the page that we're dropping our single page application on it has 2 lines in it. It has the script reference to our JavaScript, and it has the div that is the target for our React component. So again, just be careful if you're mixing, because jQuery exists on the page, you've got your React page. You just want to make sure everything plays nicely together. In terms of the actual user interface, if you're using, say, the UI or the Fluent UI, again, Power Pages is built on Bootstrap version 3. If you're using Fluent UI controls, they may not feel as native to the Power Page, because that's just not, they're using different frameworks. So just customizing those so they feel more like they sit on the portal. And we'll get to talk about the PCF controls here in a minute. But when you're building out your React components, the more you can use the Bootstrap classes and components that make it feel like it's part of the rest of the portal. I think that's the better. The more you do that, the better you're going to do. Now, in terms of actually debugging this, and this is similar to techniques that you'd use if you're building, say, PCF controls. But when we're building out using React, we're often we're debugging using Fiddler autoresponder. What that allows you to do is you basically, you upload your JavaScript for the first time, you put it on the page, you add a reference to it, and then if you're running Fiddler, you can intercept the request for that JavaScript file and have it kind of dynamically replace it with a file from your local machine. So that means every time you update your JavaScript locally, you don't have to publish that to your portal. Because every time you publish to the portal, then you got to clear the cache, and it's a huge pain in the you-know-what. So we find that using the Fiddler autoresponder to intercept those requests and replace it, then you just have to build it locally. Fiddler is going to serve that one JavaScript file locally from your machine instead of grabbing that one from your Power Pages site. So that's the best way to build those and to debug those. I still got a question here. Is there such thing as yo at Microsoft/Power Pages? I'm sorry, Jim, I'm not sure what the question is. If you could clarify your question, I will get back to that one in a minute. All right, so again, React, it's these similar techniques that we're talking about here. You could use for Angular, you could use for Vue.js, so you can certainly do that. There's nothing special about using React on Power Pages. The biggest thing is where you're going to actually upload that web file to, or how you're going to get that JavaScript reference on there. Next, let's talk about the Web API. So okay, we do have a quick question here before we get to Web API. Liquid can be embedded or be embedded in .js or no? Can this liquid.js be done in the contents of a web file node attachment? Unfortunately, no. So Liquid, there are certain places that Liquid is evaluated, and so within the contents of a JavaScript web file, Liquid will not be evaluated. So if you need to mix Liquid and JavaScript, you have to do it in web templates that are then referenced, or within custom JavaScript will evaluate your liquid. But you can't just, if you include it just in a pure web file, liquid is not evaluated in the web file. I have a question. Do you have some demo Fiddler autoresponder debug? Let me think if I've got one. If we've got time at the end, I might be able to whip one of those up, or at least bring up Fiddler on my machine and kind of show you how that works. Let me see if we got time for that at the end. All right, so let's talk about the Web API. So we've had the Web API for, I don't know, a year or two now. The big news on that one recently is that we now have the read capabilities within the Web API. So you can create, read, update, and delete records in Dataverse using the Web API. So while it is modeled after and underneath the scenes leverages the Dataverse API, it's important to note that it is a different, or like that there is a layer between the portal's Web API and Dataverse. So there are many things you can do in the Dataverse Web API that you can't do in the portal's Web API. You know, there's stuff with custom actions, or you don't have access to the metadata. So there's lots of things you can't do, but primarily what you can do is create, read, update, delete of your tables in Dataverse. So the big thing with the portals or the Power Pages Web API is that it enforces table and column permissions. So the layer of security that you'd normally have in the Dataverse Web API would be based on the user that's kind of logged in, and then when you have the ownership of records and all that sort of stuff. Whereas with the Web API for Power Apps portals, it's going to be based on the same table permissions that exist for web page, or sorry, for forms and lists. But it also introduces something that's even a little bit more granular than that, and that's column permissions. And so column permissions allow you to have certain columns that are accessible to a user or not. So, and that way you can have, elevated permissions may have more access to certain columns than others. And so, yeah, those column permissions are relatively new and are available on the via the Web API only. So if you see column permissions, they don't apply to multi-step forms or basic forms, that sort of thing. The way that the Web API is enabled is via site settings. Microsoft has some pretty good documentation on what the site settings are, but essentially it's 2 site settings per table. One is a site setting that says, yes, I want to turn on the Web API for this particular table. And then the second one is, what are the list of fields that should be enabled for the Web API? You can either put in an asterisk, which means all columns, or you can put in a comma delimited list of columns. Strongly recommend, I mean, the asterisk is nice when you're just starting to get used to it and working within development, but when you go to production, the security best practices are to reduce the scope of your API as much as possible. So don't go to production with asterisks. Go to production with the certain list of fields that you need listed in that particular application. All right. Yeah, Web API opens up a whole bunch of possibilities because you can now directly talk to Dataverse without using a companion app or any other kind of extravagant techniques. So it makes it a lot easier to write little single page applications within your thing, advanced UIs that update data in Dataverse. Okay, let's talk about PCF controls. So PCF controls are generally available for Power Pages, and that includes support for the Web API. So PCF controls, or code components, as they're also known, are, you can, in theory, download a PCF control from, say, the pcf.gallery website and drop it on a portal. That will work. But the thing you have to remember is that I mentioned kind of when we were talking about React was just because it's a valid PCF control doesn't mean it's going to work well on a portal. And it also doesn't mean it's going to look good on a portal, because a lot of those would probably be developed for either Canvas apps or model-driven apps. And so the UI frameworks that they're using may not align with the UI framework that exists on your portal. So The first thing to check if you've got an existing PCF control that you're wanting to leverage is, does it rely on things that the portal can't support? So when we talk about the dependencies that you can rely on, the portal does support the web API, but doesn't have support for things like the camera control. So if the PCF control requires some of those more exotic dependencies, then it's not going to work on your Power Pages environment. If it only kind of depends on the web API, then you have to look at, is this going to look good on my portal, or is it going to look like a little bit out of place because it's using, say, Fluent UI? Now, to actually replace, or like, where can PCF controls go? PCF controls can be used to replace a column control on a form. So if you're using a basic or a multi-step form, a common example would be, you've got a text field and you want to make it a fancy phone number field. You can replace individual fields on a form, and that's done in the same way that you do it on a model-driven app. So literally on your form, you go in and you replace that control with a PCF control, and Power Pages will respect that. As I mentioned in the news, you can use it to replace a list or a subgrid if you want to do that yourself. I know we've done some PCF controls that replace lists with maps. We've done that for model-driven apps, so that one of the views that you can select, say if you're looking at a bunch of properties, you can look at it as an actual bunch of pinpoints on a map. So that's a possibility. One thing that's somewhat unique to Power Pages is that you can actually use, there's a liquid tag called code component, so you can put it really wherever you want. So you can drop it in any sort of place. If you've got your PCF control, use the code component liquid tag to kind of drop it wherever you want. So pretty flexible, either replacing it on a control on a form, replacing a list or a subgrid, or really kind of anywhere else you can drop in liquid, you can drop in this a PCF control. Like I said, PCF controls from the community can be used, but watch out for dependencies that are supported, i.e. the camera, or front-end frameworks and how it will look and feel on Power Pages. So in terms of some best practices, the big one that I see over and over again is code reuse. So don't copy and paste your code over into 100 different places. I think the biggest one I see is Microsoft gives you like a little chunk of code that you can use to consume the web API. And we've seen sites where that's pasted like dozens of times on every little page that they want to use it. And it'd be a real shame if one day Microsoft, made an update to the way that thing worked, and they had to go touch 100 different places with that code. So use web templates and the liquid include, or create a library and host using web files or externally, kind of like what we talked about with React. So just because this is a low code, no code type thing doesn't mean we should abandon our best practices of the same line of code shouldn't appear more than once in your site. If it does, that means it should be put into something that can be reused. So definitely use either web templates or put them into a JavaScript file that you host somewhere, and then you can reference that in different places on your portal. The other one I get asked about is where should you put your JavaScript? Because unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, there are a lot of different options. So you can put JavaScript in like directly within, say, the header and footer of your site. You can put it in, as we mentioned, as web files. But you can also put it on a web page. You can put it in the copy section. You can put it in the custom JavaScript. You can put it on web, on advanced forms, multi-step forms, basic form. There's a custom JavaScript there. On lists, there's custom JavaScript. So the way that I go is be consistent. So put it, always kind of reuse the same places. Don't in one situation, say you got a page with a form on it and you want to put some JavaScript that's related to the form. Don't in some cases put it on the form, in other cases put it on the web page. That will just confuse whoever else has to come in and clean up that mess. So be consistent. I always like to put it in the place that's the furthest down. Like, so if you start out like, hey, we've got the header and footer, then we got a page, and then we have a form, like kind of following that tree down. I always like to put it kind of as far down there as I can, but also maximizing reuse. So for example, if I have a page that has a form on it and I'm putting some JavaScript that's going to change the visibility of a field, I'm going to put that in the form, because wherever that form appears, I want that JavaScript to be. Sometimes I'll see people put it on the page. It works. It's probably only going to be on one page realistically, but at the same time, I just like to be consistent. I'll put it on the kind of on the form. If it's related to the form, I'll put it on the page if it's related to the page. But generally, there's few cases where you want to have custom JavaScript in multiple places on the same page. So don't put some of it on the web page and then put some of it in the form, unless they're kind of completely unrelated and maybe that some of that code needs to be reused. But I have seen some cases where people are super confused because they see weird things happening. They've looked at the code, they don't see how it could possibly be happening, but it's because they've seen JavaScript in, say, the form, but they actually had other JavaScript. Someone else had put some other JavaScript on the page, and so things were getting conflicted. In the end, look at the source of the page, right-click and say View Source on your page, and you can see all the JavaScript that's there, but it can be a bit of a hassle to try and find it if people are putting it in all these different places. So be consistent. Try and limit yourself to one chunk of custom JavaScript per page, and maximize reuse, but then be as specific as possible. So put it on if it's related to the form, put it on the form. Don't put it on the page. So, all right, and that's kind of what I want to cover today. In a quick run through of using JavaScript on Power Pages. We do have our next call scheduled for November 17th. It's a little earlier because next month we've got the American Thanksgiving that we have to avoid. And as is traditional, that will be our last one for the year. We kind of take December off usually because no one wants to have a call during the holiday times. So we'll skip December and we'll be back in January. Do want to say again thank you to Jason and the team at MS Dynamics World for their support. And I will open it to if anyone has any questions about JavaScript, any of the news that we talked about.